There are some things one cannot say in our church. I was startled to discover this when delivering my very first sermon before a real live congregation. Oh, I'd preached before, practiced sermons with seminary peers and faculty in the pews, one sermon at a tiny church where students were the only preachers ever. All those settings were useful learning experiences, but nowhere near the same as delivering a sermon on a Sunday morning before a congregation accustomed to excellent preaching from its senior minister. I was the ministerial intern that year. I had a couple of months to gear up for my debut, and finally the day had come to climb the steps of the elevated pulpit to speak to a sanctuary filled with people my supervisor told me were theologically sophisticated. Other than being a bit on the short side, the sermon seemed to be a success. Congregants said affirming things. My supervisor was relieved that I had not embarrassed him or myself. And I went home glowing from this latest confirmation that truly I had found my vocation in ministry. Then 2 days later, my intern supervisory committee met, a group of veteran church members who, by virtue of long experience at many UU congregations and just accumulating a lot of life wisdom, were good people to provide feedback to a fledgling minister. I learned from them that I had committed a major faux pas. My sin? I said something from the pulpit that ministers should not be saying, at least not while in the role of being a minister, and certainly not while delivering a sermon. I had spoken a 4-letter word in the sermon, not an especially crude 4-letter word, because it was nothing more than the word hell. Used not as a noun referring to a particular afterlife, but used as a mild expletive, like, oh hell. I chose to use that word because I felt it added a bit of a realistic moment to what I was saying. My committee, however, experienced it as undignified. One committee member was quite emphatic that ministers simply could not, should not ever swear, because such language was not befitting a member of the clergy. Now, that happened a very long time ago. Much has changed in our culture. And because churches tend to reflect the culture, much has changed in images of what a minister should look and sound like. But in several of those 8 congregations I've served, I've heard dismay expressed about a previous minister who might have been fond of certain 4-letter words, which tells me clearly that the desire for one's minister to be dignified in their language is still very much present, liberal church or not. Now, there are 4-letter words I believe have no place in a worship service. I learned in time to exercise my favorite 4-letter words from my conversations. But beyond 4-letter words, that early experience stayed with me as a first lesson in the assumptions we all bring about church. Assumptions about what a congregation should be like. Assumptions about what a person can and cannot say in a spiritual community. All new ministers are taught that we're granted something called freedom of the pulpit, meaning I can say anything I want to while I stand up here on a Sunday morning, because one of the first paragraphs in my contract with you, in all ministers' contracts, says so. It says I'm given freedom of the pulpit. What my contract does not say, and what I had not learned until I got that feedback from my supervisory committee, and what I experience most Sundays in the receiving line of every congregation I've ever preached for, is that the congregation, you, hold what is called freedom of the pew. I can say anything I want in a sermon. You can do whatever you please with what I say. You can accept it as truth. You can reject it as false. You can be gratified and comforted by what I say. You can be offended or bored by what I say. I can speak and you can listen, or you can tune out, or now with our new screens, you can watch the service down in Dobkin Hall and speak your objections in the moment. Or you can simply do something else on a Sunday morning. Whether our respective freedoms, freedom of the pulpit and freedom of the pew, support and enrich our relationships, or whether they pull us ever farther apart so that the relationship fails, depends a great deal on how we all understand what can and cannot be said in church. All spiritual traditions offer teachings about the words we say to one another in different settings and how being mindful of what is said represents a key element in spiritual growth. The boundaries of what can and cannot be said in the context of a spiritual community have been particularly challenging for Unitarian Universalists, as that presents the need to give definition in what is otherwise a pretty undefined, freewheeling congregational style. Nevertheless, most UU congregations, including ours, lays out a few guidelines about what you can and can't say in the context of a congregational covenant. What can and cannot be said also shows up implicitly in the myriad and often conflicting assumptions each of us brings to church life and what we assume church life will be like. Because churches, for many, represent a haven from the stresses of the rest of our week. Because we rightly expect churches to be ethical communities where we will treat one another decently and practice fairness, we tend to translate those pre-existing beliefs about churches into notions that quickly set us up for disillusionment. Again and again throughout my career, I've had the sad experience of hearing from someone new to a congregation that they have found their gossip, rudeness, negative judgments, cliquish comments, thoughtlessness, all typical human behaviors that the person believed would magically disappear once they walked through the church door. Fair and kind communication should be easy in church, shouldn't it? A spiritual community is the one place where we all strive to be on our best behavior, only saying nice things to one another, only saying nice things about one another, being nice all the time. But of course, the reality is that humans are always and only human, inside a church or outside a church. And the same imperfections that hang us up outside the church will show up within our walls. We cannot not be who we are. We cannot not be flawed creatures who intend good but fall short. Along with those good intentions, we also bring with us into a spiritual community our wounds, our betrayals, our baggage, our disappointments, all that weighs us down. Just imagine what this sanctuary might look like this morning if each one of us had come carrying a few boxes, maybe a couple of suitcases, whatever we might need to contain all the dark parts of our lives. How easy would it be for us then to function smoothly with all that accumulated misery piled around us? And yet that is precisely the condition in which we gather. People who carry large hopes, wonderfully good intentions, and a fair amount of sorrow. And somehow we still want to believe that life here within the walls of our congregation will be magically perfect. Perhaps some of the clearest teaching about what we say and why as spiritual people comes from the Buddhist notion of right speech, a key element of the Noble Eightfold Path to Enlightenment. As Jerry's reading said, right speech is fundamentally a mindfulness practice, a way of challenging ourselves and one another to pay attention moment by moment to every aspect of communication. And while the term right speech suggests that I'm to be aware of the words coming out of my mouth, it also includes a listening component. Whether words are said or written, unless they're simply a note to myself, they assume somebody somewhere is receiving those words. And along with considering whether I've truly expressed what I want to say and whether the words I've chosen are correct in tone and meaning, right speech also means I take a moment, or better yet, more than a moment, to consider how those words will be received and what impact I want my words to have on the recipient of them. So it's not enough just to be clear in what I'm saying. I also am challenged to put myself in the shoes of the other person those words are directed at and try to imagine how they will hear them or read them. My first student minister sermon had been crafted carefully with an eye to ensuring I said exactly the right words, but my committee said I'd skipped a step because I had not considered what my oh-so-perfect words would sound like to the people sitting before me. We have a line in our congregational covenant that takes this guideline in two different directions, making right speech and ethic both for the speaker and for the one who's hearing the speaker. Just as I'm challenged to measure my words so they communicate clearly and to imagine how those words will sound to the recipient of those words, our covenant says that the listener not just hear what is being said, but put themselves in the shoes of the speaker. And as our covenant puts it, assume best intentions. That is, right speech means that when I'm on the receiving end of something you're telling me, however much I may or may not like what you're saying, I'm to listen to you from a perspective that believes you truly have a good heart and that you want what is best for everyone, and that your words are not coming from a place of malice or selfishness, but from a place of fairness, however hard it might be for me to imagine that as I listen to you. And that is an extremely tall order, right up there with loving your enemies or doing unto others as you want them to do unto you. Because once you're about 5 words into a communication I don't like and really would rather not hear, my defenses kick in. I start forming a rebuttal to everything you're saying, and a little voice in me starts to suggest snarky aspects to your personality. And in short order, I've gotten so caught up in thinking about what I want to say to you that I've stopped hearing what you were saying to me. Mindfulness is lost, and the covenant's broken. When my supervisory committee told me I should eliminate four-letter words from my preaching and from everyday exchanges with church members as well, I initially recoiled because I believed what they were saying was that I was supposed to always be nice. That is an injunction well-meaning parents too often give children in the form of, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. And maybe that's a good rule for children to start with, but it doesn't work for adults and ultimately not for children either. Because words that are only nice become meaningless words, because they communicate a single and not particularly significant level of who we are, what we think, how we feel. Unfortunately, pretty much all congregations have taken up this same unhelpful expectation, so that many of our exchanges around the church become much too nice and not at all authentic. A steady diet of nice words sets us up for explosions, negativity, when all that's getting excluded from all our niceness finally builds to a breaking point. And while nice can be a good thing for a while, it quickly becomes boring because it's not real. Human experience is not that controlled and certainly not that one-dimensional. To be a spiritual community where our connections with one another go deep and last long, we need to be so much more than nice. We need to be authentic, letting one another see our true selves in all their beauty and all their harshness, revealing that authenticity in right speech, in words that are carefully considered, in listening that is patient and assumes best intentions. And strange as it sounds, it's not easy, but it is entirely possible to engage in conflict without everyone leaving hurt and disappointed. The late comedian George Carlin had a famous routine built around the 7 words you can't say on television. And of course, he repeated those words over and over in the course of his routine, running them backwards and forwards and demonstrating that some of our taboos around what we can and cannot say may have long ago lost their relevance for us. Though ours is a liberal church with no creed to set boundaries on belief, I've discovered during my years as a Unitarian Universalist that we have our own set of 7 words, or maybe more, that somehow became taboo. Many of those words seem to come from traditional religion and are censored from our hymns and sermons and conversations. Because why exactly? If I ask each of you to come up with 7 things that you believe should not be said in this congregation, what would be on your list? And how many of those unsayables come from a particular spiritual tradition that you don't agree with? And how does it happen that things you don't agree with, none of us should ever say here? Right speech does not mean I hear only what I agree with, said in a benign form of voice by somebody I already know I like. If I insist that you never say something I don't want to hear, then I've absolved myself of the part of right speech that requires me to listen. Learning to maintain right speech will challenge me to listen all the way through to the end of a sentence that is saying things I don't want to hear, and not immediately jump into refuting all that was said. There's a measured quality to right speech, a pause between exchanges instead of sentences right on top of one another. that allows the speaker to know they've been heard and allows the listener to know they've fully taken in what was said. My own George Carlin list was developed after watching reactions among congregants to particular words and opinions. My list includes some religious terms and a few political ones. I've enjoyed noticing how the words on my George Carlin list have changed over time, because that tells me our congregations are changing over time. Maybe someday the list will be shortened so that I can't even come up with 7 words I can't say. I sort of think that's not likely. We are surrounded these days by a culture where the going practice is more often hate speech rather than right speech. And you're about to enter an unusual period of time as a congregation without a lead minister to give sermons like this one to remind you how to behave. Farther along, as you journey together, you'll be stepping into complex decisions about who you want to be in the next chapter of your life as a spiritual community. And in those conversations, it will always be so much easier to object and disagree and stop listening and interrupt one another to make sure yours is the voice that has the last word. But I do believe you are more than capable of keeping your exchanges with one another inside the boundaries of your covenant, of practicing right speech with one another, whether a minister is hanging out in the office or not. Yes, you'll fail, because we're all flawed humans who get overwhelmed by events and emotions, and we speak without thinking, and we keep speaking without listening. But just think of all the things you could be doing somewhere else. You choose to return here, to hope together, to work together, to grieve together, to celebrate together, to commit to this ragtag, unpredictable institution again and again. And it is because of that inexhaustible commitment this congregation will often, when any of us might least expect it, lift us into surprising, beautiful places where loving, graceful words are said as we keep each other company on this long journey to home. May it be so. Amen.